Hello, everyone. Welcome again to another episode. As we covered in the last session, where we talked about casting shadow and what light source is, how the light source affects our surfaces, and how to drop shadows based on the light directions and the light source position that you have in your scene. And today we are going to talk a little bit more or deeper about shading techniques and how to use shading in your drawings. So as you see here in this drawing. So when it comes to shading technique, there are several techniques that we can cover actually, and that might be really helpful for each drawing that you wanna do. So when it comes to drawing or shading technique, we have several techniques. So we have first what we called hatching, and this goes in one direction. We call it hatching. And the second technique is actually cross hatching, which is two directions. Of course, we are going to take a few examples reflecting these techniques. This we call cross hatching. And the third one, which we call stippling. Stippling is kind of like very time consuming technique, but very effective though. So it's actually based on like doing dots, a lot of dots, as you see here, and you increase the amount of dots where you have shadow in your area, in your drawing, in your object, and you start to fade out or gradually reduce the dots wherever you go closer to the light direction, so which we call stippling. So this technique is not that much recommended, if I'm being honest here, because it's way too much time consuming. But of course, if you have the time, it gives you very realistic results and very nice results actually. So the fourth one, which we call scumbling. Scumbling is kind like very random lines, as you see here. For example, if we have a sphere here, then we start, and the light is hitting from this direction, we start putting very random lines, as you see here. It's exactly what the name entails, so scumbling, and that's why it's called this way, because it's actually based on putting or using very random lines, as you see here. And I start to like reduce the press of my pen gradually the closer I go to the light direction, and the closer or the deeper I go to the shadow direction, I start to like kind of like press my pen a little bit harder to to give me this kind of like very hard looking line feeling, so this way. And this is what we call scumbling. The last one the last technique we can cover is actually smudging. And smudging is actually it's actually exactly what the name entails. Smudging is kind of, if you have a sphere, for example, smudging is kind of like creating smudge, which is actually well-known technique that a lot of artists or maybe also beginners uses, which actually based on like using the pen or the pencil to create kind of like smudge gradient feeling. So for this technique, a lot of people use this kind of pen, which comes together with this Faber-Castell. Hold on a second. With this Faber-Castell, which are like kind of like very good quality pen or pencil that you pencil that you can use for your drawing, and it usually comes with this kind of like special pencil. You cannot really draw with it per se, but you can actually create smudges as you see here. So if you have, for example, very hard tone in the shadow area, you can put it this way, for example, and you can use this pen to create this kind of smudge. And the smudge is actually exactly how the name entails. So it looks like a smudge. And the unique thing about this technique is actually it gives you very nice looking gradients, you know, like starting from the shadow area to the white area or the illuminated area. And this technique is especially helpful for if you are drawing like a fabric or a silk, very nice, very like smoothy looking things or objects or materials, you know, or maybe glass as well, because glass you cannot really use scumbling per se to shadow glass, because it's going to be very hard to control, you know. You will see in the few examples we are going to take afterwards. So the message I want to deliver here, these techniques offers you way too much freedom to choose which technique fits your need the most. Why we have several techniques? Because as you see here, some techniques fits for some materials and some techniques don't. For example, as we said here, smudges is used for like fabric materials like silk, like glass, very like, for example, like a curtain, very nice, very like smooth looking objects or materials. Scumbling is kind of, you can use it for several things actually, like for example, if you are shading woods, or if you are shading very hard looking materials like stainless steel or this kind of like roughy materials, you know. Stippling is, as I said previously, is very unique technique. So not a lot of people uses it, because first it's time consuming, second it's kind of like hard to control, you know. So as you see here, so as we said previously, we start with like very dark areas by increasing or generating big amount of points or dots. Then we start to decreasing this amount of dots the closer we get to the light direction. So this kind of technique is used for if you want to draw very realistic things, like for example portrait or anatomy, or you can use it for anything, literally anything, because by generating these dots, you can create any kind of material feeling that you are seeking, you know. But as I said previously, the big disadvantage of this technique is way too much time consuming, you know. So cross-hatching is one of the most common useful and used technique, because using cross-hatching you can literally draw anything, like any materials you need, like for example starting from glass, even glass that has a very smooth surface. But you can actually like control this strength of your cross hatching by reducing this, as you see here. So I can maybe start very smooth, or maybe if I am drawing like a chair, yeah, which actually has like wood material, I can maybe just increase the strength of my cross hatching, which gives me actually what I need, you know. So it really depends on your object, what kind of objects you are drawing, and what kind of material does your object have, you know. So as you see here in this example, so you can clearly see that I used cross hatching. That's like, for example, I have lines in this way once, and like once again I have my lines in this direction, or maybe this direction. Cross hatching doesn't necessarily mean that you have only only two directions. You can actually generate different directions of lines, you know, like this way. And that's why it's called cross hatching, because you are creating way too many crossed line together, you know. And yeah, as you see here, using cross hatching technique was really super helpful to get this kind of feeling like very very old ancient jar, and this lemon, and maybe these two apple as well. So for this, for these apple, for example, I could have used scampling, yeah, because it's actually kind of gives me the feeling of the apple, yeah. Nevertheless, yeah, I'm not really limited with cross hatching when it comes to drawing still drawing like this kind of object, but you can use any technique as you want, you know. Hatching, as you see here, so I used really just hatching just to create very one single directed line, like in one direction, you know, as you see. And it was kind of helpful because I didn't need more than that to create this kind of like wall feeling, you know, that this wall sits in the shadow. So moving on to reflect what we talked about in our regarding the shading technique, we are going to take a few examples. Okay, so our examples are going to be different, like with different materials and in different shapes as well. So let's say, for example, we have an apple, right? Let's start with an apple. So we first draw, let me just choose another pencil. Yeah, HB will be okay. Before starting to draw this, as I mentioned, this Faber-Castell pencil baggage offers you it's really helpful, and it actually helps you control your shading much more. You just have more freedom because it's actually start from HB, as you see here. Sorry, I don't know if it's visible for the camera. So it starts with HB, then goes up to B2, B4, B6, B8 until B14, as you see here. And of course, HB is the lightest one. I think we should cover this before starting drawing. So HB is usually the lightest one, as you see here. It actually creates very light tone. So if I go up to B2, so as you see, the tone is kind of like gets a little bit darker, and so on and so on. If I pick B4, so B4 gives me even darker tone. B6, we are not going to check all of them for the sake of time, but you got the idea, right? So this is B8, and jumping to the darkest one, B14, which is going to be this one. So this is B14, which gives you actually, as you see, way too darker tone in compared to HB. And these kind of like variety or like different kind of tone that we have helps you to generate and create much more realistic shading. You will see in our example right now. And yeah, it's very important actually to have this kind of different tone, because if you have, for example, if your apple, for example, this is our apple, yeah. So if your apple sits on the ground like this way, yeah, and the light it's hitting the apple from this direction, so this area will be illuminated, it will be bright, and this area will be really dark. So having this kind of like very different pencil tone from HB to B12 helps you to really generate very dark shadow areas, because if this area sits in the shadow, it doesn't matter how much you press your pen, you won't be able to really get very dark looking area here, no? A very dark looking tone. So the way, let's jump back to shading and shading techniques. So for Apple, as you know, Apple has like this kind of feeling, like it's smooth, but at the same time it has some kind of like randomness in its texture. So it means using cross hatching and hatching is useful. Yeah, so these two techniques. So the way I start shading is, first you have to ask yourself, yeah, where is your light coming from? So this is the direction of our light. Yeah, let's draw a very simple lamp. Yeah, this is our lamp, and this is the light source. So when we know our direction, where it's coming from, yeah, this direction, it means this area is going to be bright and this area is going to be dark. So the first area you start with is actually the dark area. So why? Because when you have a dark area shaded and you have your first tone here, it's going to be much easier to go like lighter and lighter gradually to the light area. And if we start the opposite way, like from the light area to the darkest area, it's kind of like hard to control really, because you can try it by yourself. It's much easier to go from the dark to the lightest area. So the one I do that, so cross hatching, as we said here, cross hatching is different kind of line directions. So the way I start doing it is, now I know our shadow is gonna be in that area, so I start with a very simple tone. I also gradually, as you see, release the press of the pencil a little bit. So the closer I go to the light direction, you can feel it, right? So now I am done with my first tone. Yeah, the next step is actually I move to these small areas. So for example, this area, so when the light hits from this direction, it means this area is gonna be a little bit dark. And the same goes for the leaf as well. This area is gonna be dark. So to make it as a very simple rule here, so the very first step you need to do is actually define where your light is coming from and start putting some shadows or some very light tone, you can use HB for that, in the dark area, in the shadow area. Yeah, in our example, actually here and here. So now again I go in a different direction, because we said we are going to use cross hatching, and the same as I did before, I do also one more time. I start with a little bit of pressure of my pencil in that area, and I gradually release the pressure of my pencil the closer I go to the light direction, and so on and so on. If your light source is very bright and like very strong, you can leave this area like way too bright. There is no harm in that, so it's totally okay. So but this is way too advanced. Today we are going to talk about very, very basic rule of shading. Okay, so as you see now, we started to kind of have shadows and light air, like light kind of feeling, you know, hitting our object. So now we can again come over in different direction. Do you see the as my hand direction or my line direction? It's actually going way too random now, because I'm using way too many different line directions, and I am always taking into consideration that this is the shadow area, and the closer I go there, my pressure of my pencil will be released and released less and less. I always have to take that into consideration. It doesn't matter which line direction I'm using now. As you see, now I start over again and over again and again and again and again. One recommendation I want to give you here, so do not deep dive into details in one part and completely forget the other part. So your whole object, your whole drawing needs to be going in the same harmony. So all of these components, 1, 2, 3, needs to go, even the shadow as well, needs to go in the same process, you know. So because once you finalize this area and this area is still not touched yet, so it's gonna be kind of difficult really to get these both components that they are, which belong to one object, together in one harmony, you know. It's gonna be really difficult. So I recommend you to go to walk and shade all of these parts together. So if you put another like second tone here, you do the same as well here and here as well. Don't forget our shadow, because as we talked in the last session, if you remember, of course I'm gonna link it at the end of this video. So once we have the light source hitting our object, there is a shadow that will be casted based on the light direction, the light source direction, and position as well. So how high is our light direction and the position of it? Is it like to the left, to the right, in the middle? These criteria are way too important to really understand how to cast shadow this way. Of course, if you missed this session, you can check it at the end of this video. I will link it. But yeah, taking that into consideration, we need to cast shadow for this apfel, right? Because our light direction is coming from this area. It means now if I just like very simply apply what we learned in the last session, we draw very simple vertical line from the light direction, yeah, then it crosses the ground line. Once it does, we choose the most point in our object, which is the apfel, which is touching the ground. It's gonna be this way, this one. So I mark it, then I connect them together and I draw a line. Once we do that, we do also the same for, this is point B and this is point A, okay? Again, if you missed it the last session, you need to watch it because you need to understand this. And everything is explained in the last session. So once you do that, you have one point A and B. You also connect A to the upper point of your apple. Once you do that, as you see here, this line is going to be, so if we continue drawing it, it's gonna cross with this line together. And crossing this line together will generate this point. And currently is out of our page, sorry, because we should have moved it a little bit to the left, but it's okay. You got the point. So once you have these lines crossed together in this point, this is actually going to be the shadow of our apple. So which is going to be looking approximately this way. Yeah. And the shadow, the shadow shape is as hugely depends on the light direction. So it means if your light sits instead of on the left, it sits in the center, your shadow is going to be moved this direction. So, and if your light source is sitting here, your shadow is going to be there. So you can check it in real life objects. You can just turn on your phone as the flashlight and try to hit any surfaces that you have, like a glass or anything solid, and yeah, just try it out. You will see like the shadow will be casted based on the position and there. and the heights of your light source. I highly recommend you to try that, because once you get the logic behind it, you will understand, and you will be able to cast shadow for any object that you need. It doesn't matter if it's a complex shadow or a complex object or simple object. So going back to our apple now. So as you see now, we defined the shape of our shadow. Once we do that, we again, as we said, we need to start or shade our object all together, not focusing on one area and completely forget the others. Because if we break down our object, it actually has several components. First, the apple. Second, this very small detail area. Third, the leaf. And fourth, actually the shadow, because the shadow needs to be considered as well. So once we have the shadow shape defined, again, as we did for our apple, we start to put one tone, the first tone. Then, of course, the shadow needs to be darker than the apple, so it doesn't harm to really highlight the line of your apple a little bit, because they need to be a little bit separated, you know. So now I need another tone, so I change the direction of my lines a little bit, yeah. And again, in a different direction, and again. So as you see now, I am like very much coming closer to the limitation of HB, because now it doesn't really give me any hard tone anymore that I need. So now it's a very good indicator that I need to change my pen to, for example, instead of HB, we can use 2B or 4B. It's up to you. Let's jump to 4B. It's also okay. So as we said, the shadow needs to be a little bit darker than our apple. So it means I can use 4B now to generate even darker tone for our shadow. And don't be afraid to make like not very nice looking lines or anything. Everything is fixable. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, because only by making mistakes you will learn and you will get better and better. Trust me. Yeah. So here we go. So if I still feel that my shadow is still not dark enough, I can pick another pencil which is darker. But before doing that, as we said previously, I'm just reminding you here, I cannot finalize my shadow before doing these components also at the same time. So I need to jump back to our apple to add some more details. As a darker tone, darker and darker. I'm using only cross hatching, by the way, here. So as you see, because like the apple has a material that, or the apple material is really kind of random. It is smooth, yeah, I know, but it kind of like has this kind of like very random crossed line feeling, you know. So again and again and again and again and so on. So maybe I jump to this direction, to this area a little bit. So why, as you see here, why I left just very tiny highlighted area here, because the light is coming from this area. So if we are talking realistically here, this area should be hit by our light source, and this area is kind of like, you have this kind of very small hole, you know, and that's why we will have this kind of shadow in this area, and this will be brighter because the light is hitting the surfaces. So the same goes for this one and here as well, and the leaf. Let's jump back to our leaf a little bit. Maybe we can add some more details a little bit. There's no harm of doing that. And now I jump back to our apple as well. So as you notice, before shading for any further, as you notice, I left kind of very small highlighted area here. Why? Because when we talk realistically, so let me just grab this page a little bit. So when we talk realistically, if we have a sphere, right? We have the sphere, and the sphere sits on the ground, and the light hits this area. Yeah, so from this direction, and our sphere sits in a room that has a ceiling. This is our ceiling, okay? This is just an assumption to give you the understanding behind it, okay? So this sphere sits in this room, and the light direction hits from this area, okay? So it means these are going to be bright and these areas going to be dark, right? But when it comes to real life, real world, physically speaking and realistically speaking, when the light hits these surfaces, there is something what we call in physics light bounce. So light bounce is actually exactly what the name entails. The light in our real life, even realistically speaking, bounces. It means it's like how can I explain it? Like, for example, if you have a very gummy ball that bounces, you know, so if you drop it, then it bounces back, and so on and so on. So this is actually the very simple explanation I can provide here. So this method applies also for lights. So it means when the light hits these surfaces, it actually bounces back to the opposite direction, which is this one. Once the light hits another surface of our ceiling, it bounces back down to its original previous direction, which is this one. So once it hits that, it again bounces back up in two different directions, which is the original one and the new generated one. The new generated one is this one because it bounces so and so this direction, and the original one is actually bounces this way. When the light bounces to this direction, it actually creates this very simple light illuminated highlights in this area. And this is the very simple explanation I can provide here. So it's not too complicated, if I'm being honest, because you just have to understand the logic behind it. So the same applies for our example, our apple, yeah? So once the light source hits this surface, yeah, we need to take light bounces into consideration, that the light, when it hits the surfaces or so this ground, it will be bounced back to this direction, which is actually going to create this very simple highlighted line here. So, and that's exactly the reason why I left very highlighted area. It won't be like way too dark, like 100% dark. It won't be the case, yeah? So taking that into consideration, I try to keep this area highlighted, and as you see, even with B4, I am really close to my limit here. So I pick like B6, sorry, and I start now putting even harder tone. And so on, the same approach, nothing changes. And again, as a reminder, friendly reminder here, the closer I go to the light direction, the less pressure I put into my pencil. This area is gonna be the darkest, so there is no harm to really make it dark here. Not as dark as the shadow, but we can crack it up a little bit. And if you look at an apple, if you check an apple, it is smooth and it's kind of like has this spherical shape, but at the same time, the apple is not perfectly like a sphere, like a ball. It's not perfect spherical shape. It has this kind of like, like kind of edgy feeling. You can check that in the apple. So we can actually take that into consideration by like creating this very light contrast between these areas. So you will notice what I mean. And continuing, I leave this area highlighted because you have this kind of like hole, and after having the hole you have kind of like a bump, then the apple continues to be rounded again. So, and when we take that into consideration, you have area 1, area 2, and area 3. And this is actually the bump or the chamfer that you have on these edges. So, and that's why we need some light here, because don't forget, our light is still hitting from this area, from the left side, yeah? Maybe we can go back to our shadow a little bit to make it even a little bit darker. That gives us this kind of feeling, that the sphere is really sitting on the ground and this shadow is being casted by this light source. So we can actually crack it up and make it dark a little bit. And the shadow, if we are talking about casting shadow, the shadow will be also having some gradient, so it won't be all of it 100% black. This does not exist in our world. So it means the closest or the deepest area that touches where the apple touches the ground is actually going to be our most darkest area, or the darkest area, which is actually this one. See, so now I can really increase the darkness in this area. And when we have that in our understanding that this area needs to be the darkest, I start to fade out, going up and further from this dark area. So it means the deepest area needs to be dark, and the more you go out or further from this point, your casted shadow needs to also start to fade out, as you see here. Because if we like make it 100% black or like very, very, very dark, it won't be realistic. So realistically speaking, also shadow needs to fade out slightly, as you see here. So if you see that this area, or if you notice that this area can be a little bit darker, you can really crack it up using B12 or B14 even. So I'm using now B12, okay, because it should be enough. But with B12, as you see, it gives us very nice looking shadow here, which is super helpful for this area, because this area is really going to be the darkest in our scene. Then we start to fade out a little bit. And so on and so on. So maybe I can use B12 as well. Yeah, if you really like want to try things out to maybe not, so not to use as dark as this tone, but maybe a little bit closer on our apple. There is no harm in that, actually. You can try these things out, and as I said, only by trying you will learn, and by making mistakes especially. So this area can be a little bit darker. Maybe we can crack it up a little bit. And when it comes to shading, there is also one important point I want to mention here. When it comes to shading, you really have to take the shape of your object into consideration. So what I mean by that is the apple has a spherical shape, right? So it means my line direction, they are random, yeah, but nevertheless I always take the shape of my object into consideration. So the apple has spherical shape. It means I am going, let me just draw it here. This is our apple. So as you see, I am going like this kind of line direction, if you notice. Why I'm going this direction? Because I'm taking the shape of our apple into consideration, that it needs to be spherical, you know? So it needs to have this shape, otherwise it won't be looking as an apple. So once you have the understanding of your shape, of your object shape, then you can actually try to align your line directions to match the shape of our objects. So for example, if I am drawing another example, like a mushroom, yeah, let's say mushroom, okay? So for example, so when I draw a mushroom, then I need to take that into consideration, that the mushroom has kind of like half spherical feeling. So I can maybe try to align my lines, shading lines, to match the shape of our objects. The same as well in the interior, and so on and so on. So this is very, very simple example. Of course, we are not going to continue drawing it because this is our example for today. So going back to this, we can maybe, this area needs to be a little bit darker. So I'm using only cross hatching, okay, technique. So again, we jump back to this area because we shouldn't forget about it. Everything needs to go together, not finalizing one area and completely forget the other ones. Yeah, because this way you have more control over your drawing, you know. And the leaf as well. Going back to our apple, now we can use actually scumbling, which is like very random lines. Only after having way too many tones now, because if you start with it, it's gonna be very hard to control afterwards. Yeah, of course you can do, so once you are advanced and you have more experience and you trust your hand and your pencil more, you can actually use different techniques in one object, like scumbling and stippling and cross hatching and hatching all together. There is nothing wrong. So as long as you give the expected look and you keep the realistic rules, like when it comes to light source and casting shadow and so on, and shading, it's really up to you which technique you use. There is no one rule, there is no written book, you know. You can use whatever you want, but at the beginning, and especially if you are a beginner, there are some recommendations, you know, I can say here. So So for example, like as I said in the first lesson, in the beginning, at the beginning of this sessions, so if I'm drawing or if I'm shading glass, I'm definitely not going to use scrambling, like very random lines, because it's going to be way too hard to control, really, because the glass material needs to be very smooth, right? So moving on with our apple, maybe this area can be a little bit darker. We can crack it up a little bit further. There's no harm in that. Adding more tone into it. As you see here, if you feel like you put very hard line, it's always fixable by actually adding more lines around it to make it fade out, you know? So don't be afraid. And as you see, I started drawing this apple, shading it, and coming to this very dark tone that we are currently using without even using a razor. You don't have to do that. Of course, at the beginning, you can always use a razor. I'm not saying it's wrong to use it, of course, but what I'm saying here, so the more you draw, the more skills you will get, and the more control over your pencil you will have, until you get to the point that you don't really need any eraser if you are drawing. But there is nothing wrong in using it, so don't get me wrong, please. Okay, here we go. So a little bit darker here, just to make this kind of feeling, you know, that it's spherical, but it's not super smooth, like a ball. It won't be like a ball, you know, unless you have like a plastic fake apple. So this is a different scenario. We are talking about real apple here. Maybe a little bit harder area here, a little bit, to kind of like give this feeling, you know. Then again, cross-hatching. So with cross-hatching, don't forget to always change the line of your directions and change the pressure of your pencil. Everything needs to be considered, and the sphere, the shape of your object, the light source, everything needs to be considered. And don't feel overwhelmed. The more you draw, the more you will get into that, and the more you will understand these rules, and it will be automatically, without even thinking about it, it will be considered and reflected automatically into your drawing, as you see here. A little bit further, a little bit further. Maybe I go back to my HB, just to add very light tone here. Cross hatching, okay? Different line, different directions. Just try it out, don't be afraid. Then maybe I go to P14, which is the darkest I have actually, just to add just a few stroke here, which I really need to get this feeling, you know. But when you use P14 or P12, you have to be a little bit careful, because the tone that is generated by these pencils are really dark, and sometimes it's hard to raise, you know. Like for example, if P14, yeah. If you put this one and you use a razor, this one or a different razor, it's almost impossible to get rid of, you know. As you see, it's way too dark. Even with the razor, I'm not able to get it out. So you have to be a little bit more careful, okay? Maybe as well this, because this needs to be really, really dark, as we said previously. Yeah. And adding some more tones into this area, which is going to be really dark, considering the light direction. And maybe we can go back now to B6 is okay. Yeah, B6 is okay. Maybe add some more details. To give me this kind of feeling, you know, Bambi feeling, if you want to call it this way. This is our ground. Don't forget about it. So, as you see here, talking about our ground, our apple is sitting on the ground, right? As we said previously. So, and this shadow will be casted this way, but it doesn't mean that this area of our ground needs to be bright as it is now. So, having that said, it means we can add some very light tone here using HB, or what I'm using, HB now, into our ground, because it won't be like 100% white, you know. It's gonna have very simple tone. The same goes for this way as well. Don't forget that the light is hitting from this area, so it's gonna be really, really bright here. So the tone I'm putting here or generating is way too light. And instead of holding my pen this way, because most people holding it this way, you can hold it this way. See? Because this releases the pressure of your pencil way better than in compared to this direction. Yeah, here we go. So I put very simple tone here. We can use again cross hatching, not only one direction, so we can go maybe this way or maybe this way. It's up to you. There is no written book about it, so as long as you get the feeling and you get the look that you need, then it should be okay. We can maybe also just create this kind of very light tone to give the feeling that this leaf is also casting some shadows on the wall. It won't be like 100% one-to-one matching look or matching shape. Like, I'm not going to draw another leaf here on the wall, but this kind of like having this kind of dark tones that looks like a leaf, it gives me the feeling that there is something casting this shadow, which is our leaf actually here. And the same goes for this branch. As you see and notice, I'm using very light tone here. I'm not really pressing and drawing any shapes on the wall. So it's just like to give us the feeling that there is some objects and some surfaces generating this shadow, you know. And the same goes for this one, this surface as well. Maybe we can just a little bit like this way. Not too much, because it will look odd if it's too dark. So it's gonna be like maybe this way. Just a tiny hint of tone, you know. And again, just a little bit. And when it comes to that, it doesn't really harm if you highlight these lines of your apple, just to kind of like divide it from the surface of the wall, because now they start to kind of like get merged together. But you have to be careful really, because the lines I'm going to highlight are not going to be in the highlighted area where the light is hitting, but actually in the shadow area. And at the same time, I'm not really using big pressure of my pencil. So you will see, I'm gonna like just like kind of highlight these lines, which are actually sitting in the shadow, by the way, as you know. And we take maybe B2 is okay. See, just a tiny hint of line that gives us this division between the apple object and the wall. And if I feel that my line is way too harsh or too hard, maybe I can just start to merge it with the apple to the inside surfaces, yeah, not the outside, okay? As I am doing now. And cross-hatching again, I'm changing the direction of my lines constantly. And as you see here, I am always keeping this highlighted area, because it's very, very important to make it look realistic, that the light that is coming from this area is actually hitting the surfaces and bouncing back from the ground to the bottom surfaces of our apple as well. So this is very, very important to take into consideration, because like on the other side, if we would have made this area completely black, it will look like shadow. Yes, I know, but taking this light bounces into consideration by generating this very highlight area will make it, as you already see, way more realistic. You know, it actually looks like a real light is hitting this apple. So you might think there are like some like small rules, but they are important. Trust me on this, they are really important, and they need to be taken into consideration if you really be advanced, or you want to get really advanced into drawing, shading, and so on and so on. So yeah, I would say this is our session for today. Shading wise, I can deep dive into adding more details into our apple, of course, But for the sake of the time of our session, I'm gonna stop here. You got the idea how it works, and also the important points that needs to be considered and reflected and used. So yeah, try things out, try the techniques that we talked about, and yeah, just have fun. Don't be afraid to make mistakes, because only by mistakes you will learn and get better and better. And yeah, if you want to experience like good kind of like shading feeling, you can get different tones. Not necessarily, you don't necessarily need all of these, by the way. You can maybe have HB, B4, B6, and B12. So 4 will be more than enough actually. So yeah, try things out, and you can also try this apple step by step, of course. And in the next session, we are also continuing to talk about shading. Shading is a very big topic, by the way, when it comes to drawing, because yeah, shading is very important, lighting is very important, and shading techniques are very important. Depends on the object that you have and the material of this object. So in the next session, so having that said, in the next session, I would like to take another example, like for example, maybe like cup, stainless steel cup, which has like different shape and completely different material, or maybe like plastic bag, or glass. Yeah, let's see in the next session. But we are going to cover something else. Shading, yes, the same topic but different technique. Okay, so yeah, thank you very much for watching. This was it for today. Try it out, enjoy it, and thank you very much for watching. Bye bye.